Alan, please introduce yourself. Thank you.
Thanks very much, John, and it's good to be with everybody today. My name is Alan Brill. I'm a Senior Managing Director at Kroll, which is a unit of Duff Phelps, a well-known consulting firm, as is Kroll. In addition to my work as a Senior Managing Director in Kroll's Cyber Risk Group, I also teach some courses on cyber terrorism for the NATO Alliance. And I'm also an adjunct professor at the Texas A&M School of Law, where I teach in our program, which for those who are attorneys grants an LLM in risk management, and for others gives a degree called a Master of Jurisprudence in Risk Management. So as I guess I'm an instructor also, as I said, for Texas A&M, I should start by saying howdy, everyone, and thanks for being with us today. I'd also like to just read a very brief disclaimer for the record, and you'll see them on the slides. Now, these slides in this presentation have been prepared for general information purposes only. They do not and should not be construed to constitute legal or other professional advice. So with that, I'm going to be talking about people. And the thing to remember is that in all the years that I've been looking at cybercrime, I've never yet run into a cybercrime that was committed by a computer. They may run on computers, they may be facilitated by computers, but generally there's a person behind it that we look to. Now, will this continue? How will artificial intelligence change that? You know, and will we get to a point where we have to think about how to make an artificial intelligence, self-learning, deep learning computer a defendant in a criminal case? And the answer is, I don't know. But what I do know, and let's advance the slide, is that right now there is a danger. And the danger is that we focus too much on the technology, the cyber side, and not enough on the fact that if you think about the different disciplines in the organizations that are part of the Joint Cybersecurity Group, we worry about things like people. We worry about things like internal controls. We worry about things like policies and procedures. And my talk today is to really focus on why those things are and will remain important and, in fact, central to cybersecurity. I want to talk about 5 things. First, the nature of the problem. Why are we continuing to see issues? Why are those issues evolving so quickly? And I'd like to then turn to the fact that, as you all probably know, in recent weeks, regulators, particularly the Securities and Exchange Commission, has been talking about cybersecurity and threat responsive controls, as one way to put it. I'd then like to talk about standards, policies, procedures, and how those mirror, or in many cases may not mirror, reality. And then I'd like to go into how this has become a global issue, and in fact, sometimes a global issue for companies that didn't know that they were global. And then I think it becomes important to close by answering a question, and a simple question to pose at least, and it is, what's a company to do? So let's proceed to the next slide. When we think about the nature of the problem, the one thing that is certain in an uncertain world is that when it comes to cybersecurity, we're shooting at a moving target. And that target is one that cannot be looked at solely from a cyber perspective, but has to be looked at from the perspectives of technology, law, regulation, best practice, and probably a dozen others that any of you could name. John, let's move to slide number 4, please. And I'd like to consider, just as a starting point, some events that have happened in the past few weeks. Some of you will undoubtedly know about these in some detail. Some of you may know about them, but may not have gone into the depth of reading the various legal documents, complaints, orders, investigative reports. Now, let's just think about a few of them. The SEC announced a $1 million settlement with Voya for what were felt by the commission to be issues relating to their cyber security. Facebook had a compromise that, depending upon which news release you looked at, might have affected 50 million people, or maybe 30 million people, or maybe some other number of people. But regardless of which number you look at, it was an awful lot of people, wasn't it? And probably affected many of us on the call. The SEC filed a lawsuit against Elon Musk and against the Tesla company based on several Twitter tweets that Mr. Musk sent about a private buyout of the company. There is a proposed settlement. I don't think it's been finally adjudicated by the supervisory judge, but the settlement that was put before the judge for evaluation called for a financial penalty of $20 million from Mr. Musk and $20 million from Tesla on the basis they should have been better supervising the use of social networks to make important announcements. A couple of days ago, the SEC issued an investigative report on business email compromises and warned that it was looking at accounting and other controls to be continuously updated as the threat environment changes. This investigation looked at 9 companies that had been victims of business email compromises. And while the commission staff found, as a result of these investigations, that there were problems, the commission decided not to proceed with enforcement actions. But they felt that this was an important enough subject to issue a public investigative report that didn't name the names of the victims, but certainly should be delivering the message that this is something you need to worry about. According to Gemalto, in their breach level index published for the first 6 months of 2018, they followed 945 breaches that resulted in the compromise of 4.5 billion, that's billion with a B, records, which included financial, healthcare, PII, and others. If you do the math, that's the equivalent of an average of about 25 million records a day, or 291 people's records being compromised on average every second, 24/7, over a period of 6 months. If you look at one of the new emerging areas of cryptocurrency, CipherTrace reports that in that same period, $760 million of value of virtual currencies were lost due to hacker activity, which was a little bit more than 3 times the amount that was lost in all of 2017. Now, they are not suggesting in their report that this was due to the hackers being able to somehow break the security of the blockchain or of other distributed ledger technologies. But for the most part, these were pretty much good old-fashioned attacks that worked, but were an enabler for the bad guys to take control of virtual currency wallets that were stored by the organizations they victimized. And whether we're talking the amounts of these settlements, whether we're talking the number of records, whether we're talking the $760 million lost in hacks of virtual currency sites, we're talking big numbers. And before I go on, let me say that everything we're talking about, while in some cases I'm using the specific examples cited by the Securities and Exchange Commission, by no means am I suggesting that what I'm talking about should be limited in interest to those whose organizations may be overseen by the Securities and Exchange Commission. They are not the only regulator talking this way. Certainly, the other financial regulators are putting time and resources into this. Certainly, others like the Federal Trade Commission have shown an interest. And as we'll see, there are a couple of other reasons why, even for organizations that are not directly supervised by a federal regulatory agency, I think there's good reason to take these lessons very personally. Let's go to slide number 5, please. So the one thing that is certain from looking at all of the reports that I've talked about and the reports that I would bet that most of you on the call have looked at, the velocity of change in cybersecurity and internal control, if anything, is rising. But it also turns out, and again, this is something that you'll know, that many of the incidents and problems that we read about, that we see, were preventable. And, there are questions we can all ask. Why was the cyber security that was found problematic in the Voya case the way that it was? Why were the tweets that were the subject of the Elon Musk Tesla case brought in federal court by the SEC able to go out as they were? Why are business email compromises actually working so well and so frequently that the SEC would go to the time, expense, and trouble of putting out a report on the 15th, which is certainly worth reading if you haven't read it, that goes into a lot of details about these compromises. Why are businesses in the virtual currency world being hit with successful attacks that aren't attacking the underlying distributed ledger technology, but seem to be working so well with millions of dollars lost, often forever? Or why are so many attacks using well-known, well-documented, well-understood methodologies so successful, and why is that the case on a continuing basis? I think the answer to that, or at least to some of those questions, are that the bad guys who we talk about, and when I use the term bad guys, some of those bad guys can be female as well as male. I don't think the computer cares who is stealing from it, but I'll just use, in some cases, the term the bad guys. Why are they so successful? Because they understand not only technology, but they understand that people underlie the entire technology system. And I think it is true to say that if an organization doesn't accept the concept that building effective controls, actually implementing those controls, having a good compliance program in place to let you know if your controls are in place, if they're working, if there are new risks, and not having a continuous improvement program that can make sure that your responses are in line with the changing risk. If you don't really accept that as an organization, that is definitely not a good thing. And John, let's go to slide 6, please. I'd like to talk about the fact that regulators have been focusing on cybersecurity and the need to have internal controls, both cyber-related, accounting-related, process-related, as something that you need to look at. And with that, I'd like to go to slide number 7. So earlier this year, if we go back to probably about February of March of 2018, the Securities and Exchange Commission put out a number of documents which essentially said that the SEC, along with other regulatory agencies, understand the importance of cybersecurity and that there is an absolute expectation on the part of the regulators that companies would heed that guidance and pay attention to having effective cybersecurity, commercially reasonable cybersecurity, cybersecurity that is compliant with the guidelines of regulators, along with any other guidelines that organizations have recognized that they should be following, whether those are something as simple as the CIS Top 20 or the standards that we find from ISO or from NIST or from ISACA or anybody else, that those be really important and that those be something that companies recognize are guidance that has to be heeded. As I said before, the SEC is not the only ones looking at it. As many of you know, the role of the Federal Trade Commission in cybersecurity was affirmed by the Third District Court of Appeals in the Federal Trade Commission, the Wyndham case, and regulators like the FDIC, Control of the Currency, are all giving versions of the same message. State-level regulators are not ignoring the issue. We can look at some of the regulatory guidance in the laws recently passed in California as an example. We can look at the regulations promulgated by the New York Department of Financial Services. But we should also recognize that an honest look at the situation shows us that both state regulators and state attorney general are mindful of this issue and have expectations that companies will heed good practices with relationship to cybersecurity and operational controls. Let's go to slide 8, please. There is underlying all of this when I talk to friends in the regulatory agencies, a recognition that cybersecurity, which was something that they used to really think of pretty much as a separate area of interest and consideration, isn't anymore. It is now so intertwined in every phase of a company's operations that you can't realistically think of cybersecurity as a completely separate issue. It's one of the basics, like effective accounting controls, but it is deeply intertwined and has become a touchstone for every phase of security and control within the modern organization. Now, when I talk to colleagues in the regulatory agencies, they remind me and have asked me to remind you that they are not just talking the talk. They have invested significant resources and have brought aboard and have trained people who are now completely qualified to look at cybersecurity from a conceptual level and at the deepest operational and technical levels. They know how to conduct cyber-related investigations and to draw conclusions from those investigations. They are absolutely not hesitating to bring enforcement actions and to pursue those actions vigorously. The regulators understand that aside from the fact that you bring these actions to specifically remediate and to an extent punish behavior by an individual or an individual within an organization, that you also bring these to send a message to an industry or to those across many industries. They expect that institutions recognize that the guidance that they have been talking about over the past few years do not represent their suggestion to you as a friend, but rather you have to take those as a statement of actual expectations, and that ignoring the guidance for those organizations that are regulated is something that you do at your own risk. And ignoring it is not going to make the regulators go away. It is not going to give you a free pass with an assumption that they're going to ignore you. Let's go to slide number 9. There's something else that they are reminding us of. And if any of you have read the order in the Voya case, you will find this on the last page of the order, not in the last paragraph before the signatures, but the one just above that. What the regulators are also saying is that the same conduct that a regulator might use to bring a regulatory action and to impose regulatory penalties against an organization can also be the subject of other litigation. For example, a shareholder suit could be launched against the company's officers and directors based on the identical problems and findings that were in a government agency's report or complaint. So that whether you're regulated or not, a class action could be filed on behalf of shareholders or any other relevant constituency, saying that the management and the board did not exercise the control that they were required to exercise that could have prevented an issue that actually came about to come about, or to properly protect the value of the company, which can suffer both as a result of direct losses or reputational damage if an incident does occur. They're also saying that the controls, whether we think of them as cyber controls or accounting controls, have to be based not just on what somebody feels like doing or just sort of thinks is right, but on the basis of an updated and documented risk assessment. This is not a matter of guesswork. It is not just a matter of, yeah, I've done this before, but what the regulators and I think based upon what the regulators are doing, what the courts are likely to be looking at in the future, is that you have a security plan, both cyber and accounting, that is based on a fair evaluation of the risks that you are facing as those risks evolve, whether that risk involves a business email compromise, whether that risk involves the kinds of issues that can be remediated by going to a newer version of an operating system, whether it's something that could have been averted through better training, a better program of internal audits and compliance. What they're saying is you gotta have a good risk assessment that should be in writing to show that your plan was based on a realistic view of what the dangers were. Now, I think that as I look across the regulatory agencies that I and my colleagues, both at Kroll and at Duff Phelps, talk to regularly when we look at the cases that come across the desks of our people in the work that we do, I think there's one more very important point that the regulators are collectively making, and that is that without the commitment of people at the top and of people at every level of an organization, technology alone cannot save a company from cyber risks. And let's go to the next slide, which is really a title slide. So let's just go, John, to slide 11. As John had mentioned, by the way, this slide deck in the form of a PDF will be available to you. So recognize that you can have a copy of this. I tried to put a bunch of words on them simply so that they would be useful to those of you listening or those of you who listen to this later, and that you can adapt them for your own use. So let's talk about standards and policies and procedures, and let's compare and contrast them against reality. So good intentions with regard to standards, policies, and procedures are good, but they ain't documentation. Yes, we all understand that good security starts with a commitment from senior management and increasingly from the board. But that commitment must be accompanied by the intention, the willingness, and the ability to expend the necessary resources, whether those resources are people, money for technology, money for outsourced services, whatever it is, to achieve a commercially reasonable, regulatory compliant set of controls and security measures. That's what you will be measured against, either by a regulator or through the oft painful process of litigation. But those commitments should be documented, and they should sit at the top of what you could think of as a pyramid of standards and policies and procedures and controls and compliance measures, and a continuous improvement process by which you not only recognize issues that come about through the evolution of risk, but from the lessons that you learn from incidents that actually affect your organization. Documentation, of course, is not a one and done process. As the risks evolve, as you hear about cases of actual problems, these represent risks that were less severe or different in the past. And you have to have that commitment that I'm talking about to a continuous improvement program. And I think no matter what framework you look at, They all include that. So let's go to slide number 12. I had a case some time ago where a company had gone through multiple substantial data breaches. But when we were in there doing the investigation and got a hold of their standards and policies and procedures manual, it was a work of art. I can tell you on my academic side, if this was given to me by a student as a term project, the student would get an A+ in honors. They were beautiful. They were well crafted. They were well written. They were literate. I've never seen a better set of standards anywhere. Unfortunately, we discovered when we interviewed the CIO that when we wanted to discuss those standards, the CIO started laughing at us. And when we looked kind of curious as to why mentioning the standards would cause hysteria, he told us that they were actually written by a group of summer interns that he was, to use his words, forced to hire. And he told us this as far as he was concerned, and he was the CIO, so that was pretty important. These standards were, and again, I'm using his words, aspirational. Yes, of course he'd like to do them. Yes, he recognizes that it would be great if he could do them, but resources were scarce. He felt that the security worked in his company mostly because people just knew what to do and they knew what not to do. But when we looked at the discovery material that had been provided in the case, we found that that very manual that he called aspirational had been presented to the board of directors, and in the presentation to the board, nobody said aspirational. They said, yep, this is what we're doing, and the board believed them, and as a result, kind of felt good about how things were going. Aspirational standards are nice, but my friends, they do not cut the mustard or anything else. Let's go to slide 13. Now, good documentation is good, but the question that a regulator, a litigator, and your board should be asking is this: do the controls really work? And do they really work? Really? So not only were those standards, the aspirational ones, not actually being followed, but when we examined the organization to find out why there had been breach after breach after breach, we found that there were no processes in place to know exactly which controls were or were not actually implemented. So there wasn't a real compliance program. There was nothing to show what risks were or weren't considered because there was no documented risk assessment. Nobody, as a result of that, knew what gaps there were between the risks that should have been covered and what was or was not actually happening. There was, as I said, no compliance plan, no process by which problems raised in an actual incident would be focused on and really, really solved. And when we looked at the details of the second big breach that that organization had, it was in its essence identical to the first breach, but they never had a process to get to the root cause of the problem and make sure that it was fixed across their entire network, across all of their locations, across all of their offices. And as a result of that, the weakness that allowed the first breach to happen in one of their offices was able to be re-executed by the bad guys and start the chain of infection, of data loss, and of compromise again. Now, the regulators understood this. And the board and executives understood this. But the fact that there were no controls that would let somebody know that the things that you thought that were happening in your internal controls weren't really there. And that was at the heart of the problem. And let's go to slide 14, please. So we really do believe that in developing your system of controls in cybersecurity, that your compliance and your internal audit people should be a key part of the team from the outset to make sure there are ways to know whether your controls are or are not working. Over the years, I've seen far too many cases when compliance and internal audit wasn't brought in until fairly late in the program. And by that point, it became more and more difficult to really figure out how to audit, to have the resources to audit, to have the kinds of reports and warnings in place that a compliance or audit-oriented person would want to have in there. So they were playing catch-up. I'm also firmly of the belief that a system of controls, that cybersecurity, should be something that you engage your general counsel on. You want guidance to make sure that your documentation, your processes, and everything else are compliant with regulations. And very often, those represent a legal opinion. Further, as we've moved into what we all think of as cloud computing, we've seen many cases in which somebody within an organization finds a cloud provider, whether it's to do some sort of calculation or processing as a service or storage as a service, that can be engaged through a click-through contract and paid for on an employee's credit card, later reimbursed through an expense reimbursement system. That's not good. When you're clicking through that agreement, it is a legal agreement that may have things that would scare the hell out of your counsel. For example, what if there's no definition of where your data would be stored? What if your data was stored someplace that has strong cybersecurity laws and regulations that you never knew you were involved with? And that brings me to our final section of new information. And if we can go to slide 16. I have found many times that companies that thought they were purely domestic turned out, because of the evolution of technology, to be multinational. Now, you know that the trend to regulate security, cyber, privacy, is not limited to the United States. As I try to point out on this slide, an increasing number of countries and multinational organizations like the European Union have passed laws and regulations that specifically relate to cybersecurity, to privacy, to transborder data flows. So one question I ask you to ask is, do you know where your data is stored by your cloud provider? And I can tell you one place that it's not, because many times you'll ask the question, where is our data? And the answer is, it's in cyberspace. Well, that's fine, except for the fact that, as you know, cyberspace doesn't exist. Everything that happens in a computer or a storage device happens in a real piece of technology, in a real place, in a real country, subject to real laws. So, for example, if your cloud provider decides to venue your data storage in a country with laws relating to cyber protection, transborder data flow, privacy, your data may suddenly whether you know it or like it or not, be subject to that country's laws. So have you checked with your business partner to determine where in the world your data is stored? Don't make an assumption that everything is okay. Find out. Find out what cloud-based contracts are in place, whether you know about them now or don't. Have counsel look at those, find out where the data is venued, find out where the processing is done, find out what is being held by the processor, and have counsel look to see whether how it's happening imposes regulatory, legal, or other requirements on you. So with that, let's go to slide 17. And as I really said, this is just another area where counsel, and this could be in-house counsel, it could be external specialized counsel, can really be invaluable. Have them look at contracts, have them look at agreements, have them look at things like data venue, data ownership, duty to notify if there is an incident, whether there is indemnification agreements in place that if your vendor screws up and you suffer a data breach of your client's information, your customer's information, whether you are insured by their insurer so that you don't get stuck with the bill. And with that, let's go to slide 18 and then slide 19. So, my friends, what's a company to do? I think we have to take it as a proven fact that regulators are absolutely focused on cybersecurity, use of social networks by companies. They are ready, they are willing, they are going to undertake investigations. They are going to file litigation. They are going to impose financial and potentially operational and potentially life and death type penalties to organizations that don't do the right thing. They are staffed. They are ready. They are serious about it. So I think you need to make a commitment from the very top, not just to give lip service to the concept of, yeah, we know this stuff is important, but to do the things listed on this slide, to carry out a risk assessment, to understand what you're protecting against, and to update it as necessary, to identify, determine how to deal with security gaps, to use a framework or at least a list of key security issues like the top 20 list to make sure that you're covering the basics along with making sure that you're compliant with regulations. Use risk mitigation, fix it, make the risks less likely to occur using both technical and non-technical means. Understand risk transfer, another way of saying insurance. What does it cover? What doesn't it cover? Do you have to think about the effects of things like not just cyber insurance, but the changes in regulatory expectations and the willingness of litigators to look at things like going after directors, going after company officers, which would affect what's called your D&O, director and officer coverage. And understand the risks that are being accepted as just part of what you need to do business. Make compliance and internal audit and counsel an integral part of your plan. Have a tested and ready to go incident response plan. There are new laws that say that once you become aware of an incident, you have to report it within 72 hours. That's not much time. And if you haven't pre-identified the vendors you're going to work with for forensics, if you're dealing with credit card data, you probably want to have an organization that is approved by the credit card industry as a preferred forensic investigator in place. You may want to have specialized counsel ready to go. You may want to have a crisis communication firm ready to go. In doing those, work with your insurer, because in many cases, they will have a panel of pre-identified experts who have agreed to provide those services at special rates for the insureds of the insured. So do that, test the process, have a tabletop exercise, have a backup to everybody that you think is a part of that process, because people go on vacation, people leave, people become unavailable. And have a process for continuous improvement. Recognize that what I am talking about and what we're talking about today in this webinar is fundamentally a commitment by people, so that while we talk about technology, technology alone is not the solution. As I said at the beginning, it's all about people. People on your board, people in your technology organization, people in your compliance group, people in your internal audit group, people in your operations group, people in your accounting function. Working together, we can make a difference. If we focus on the technology and don't focus on the people, we could be headed in a problematic direction. So, as it says on slide 20, thank you very much for listening, and let me now turn the chair back to my friend, John Checco.
Alan, thank you very much. And I'll solicit for questions, but I know there's a delay in the broadcast. So as we solicit for questions, I actually had 2 questions about your presentation. First of all, it's interesting because where Jeffrey said people have the capabilities to really help themselves do better. You pointed out the human nature where people actually have the capabilities of talking themselves out of doing something. So I thought that was pretty interesting.
Yeah, it really is, John, because if you look at the nature of the business email compromises, when you investigate them, and we get a number of these every week that come across our desks at Kroll, that the people that moved the money knew better. They really did. But they were able to be intimidated. They were able to be flattered. They were able to be coaxed to violate the rules that they knew were in place to the detriment of their organizations. So it is really about people. I think the number one thing that an organization can do to defend against like a business email compromise is to have your people really understand that if they do the right thing, follow the rules, you got their backs. That no matter the threats that are made on the emails, they're good as long as they follow the rules, tell somebody what's going on, and don't send out the money just because somebody asked you to do it. Don't change the bank that the money goes to just because somebody on an email or on a telephone call said to do it.
Cool. Actually, so one of the questions I had was about the 72-hour rule. I know in working through a bunch of incidents, there's a legal definition of incident, confirmed incident, and suspected incident. With the 72-hour rule, are they allowing for confirmed incident? And if that's the case, are they allowing? Is there a maximum time between suspected and confirmed?
Well, this is really based on the new rules that are part of GDPR and that are coming out of the European Union. And I guess the answer to that is it has to be, once you know something has happened. But beyond that, I haven't seen a lot of guidance. So what we're telling clients is it's smart to be ready. It's smart to have your plans in place for what you're going to do. It's vital to have the support pre-negotiated, since in a 72-hour scenario, you don't have a lot of time to play with terms and conditions of contracts, and that every organization is really going to do as well as it can, but recognize that working with specialized counsel who knows the details of the rules, ultimately you're going to have to comply with the rules as they're being interpreted.
And that's great because that dovetails into my second question. You talked about plans being aspirational versus tactical.
Yes.
In my experience, how many of the regulations or standards have been aspirational versus tactical? And a good example is, the FFIEC is purely aspirational. GDPR is a regulation, but yet really open to some broad interpretation. So, wondering how we work around those things.
Well, I think the thing that's kind of interesting is I talked during my little presentation about the next to the last paragraph in the FOIA order. And in this, the SEC said, hey guys, don't just think about us. Think about the fact that the kinds of regulations that we're putting into place will be seen as an expectation on the part of shareholders, data subjects, and others who can without any action on our part, litigate against you and enter into a class action, enter into whistleblower complaints, enter into a whole range of things, so that you have to look beyond the regulators and what they can do and be prepared for the range of problems that can occur. And that's why I say, even if you're not regulated by any of the FFIEC family or the SEC or perhaps state regulators, you're still subject to litigation. You're still subject to all kinds of potential problems. But we found that those organizations that recognize that and operate on that basis tend to get through the incidents a lot better than those who get surprised when those actions are filed.
Great. Well, thank you very much. I see.
My pleasure. I hope it was useful for folks.
Yeah. No further questions in the chat.